Welcome to the Magic in the Cloud podcast, where exceptional visionaries reveal the personal journeys behind their remarkable success. This is a conversation with leaders who've transformed industries by navigating pivotal moments, making bold decisions, and cultivating extraordinary teams. We explore the turning points that define their careers, those instances where intuition met strategy and everything changed. It's an intimate look at the leadership philosophies that drive revolutionary outcomes, with cloud solutions as the quiet enabler. Here are your hosts, Joseph Griffith and Ryan Golombeski.
Hey everybody, welcome to another episode of Magic in the Cloud. Today my guest is an MIT-trained behavioral economist who spent decades studying how people make financial decisions and discovered that many decisions are driven far more by emotion than analytics, which for me is great to hear because I don't want to do all the analytics. I trust that you can do that, but I really want somebody to connect with me emotionally. With that, everybody, please meet my next guest, Mr. Chris Heye. Chris, welcome to the show, sir.
Hey, Joe. Thanks for having me. Really excited to be here.
Yeah, so here we are. You're this fancy MIT-trained guy, behavioral economics, and now you're building all kinds of AI tools. When you put all that together, what insights are most people missing about the future of financial advice?
Sure. One thing I want to say, just for all those people who are kind of obsessed with credentials, I'm technically not a MIT behavioral economist. Technically not, but I did study a lot of it at MIT, and I studied a lot.
Nice.
I'm sort of a behavioral economist. My undergraduate degree was in economics, but I've been studying this for years and years and years. And I was on that behavioral train back in college, and it's part of the reason why I didn't go all in on economics. Maybe I should have, but I didn't, because I just thought back then a lot of the behavioral assumptions aren't quite what they are now. And it was just a little too rigid for my taste. But anyway, what are people missing? I think there's a few things that people are missing. And I would say that the people who are missing it are more the professionals than the everyday consumers. And I'll explain what I mean there. I think starting with the consumers, I don't think they're missing much. I mean, if you look at these surveys about what they really care about, it usually goes well beyond concerns about what the stock market's going to do or what the Fed's going to do or what the tax rates are going to be. They're usually much more focused on really the everyday personal things that are happening to them and their family. They're really focused on healthcare costs, long-term care costs, cognitive decline. You see kind of over and over that these tend to be the top concerns that everyday people have, especially, the sort of pre-retirees or those in retirement. They're really concerned about this stuff and they really want protection from this stuff. I think sometimes on the professional side, those factors are either sort of underestimated, overlooked, or just seen as, I don't do that. I don't talk about health, or I don't talk about longevity. And I think it's if we're talking about financial professionals, I think it's really to their disadvantage. Because again, these are the things that clients are really concerned about. And, a lot of advisors don't get training in this area. So I get it that they're maybe uncomfortable. But I think that the successful ones, when I think of, going forward, I think the successful financial professional will be the ones who can relate to clients, who can understand those concerns about their health and longevity and help them prepare for them. And, with a really strong dose of empathy along the way.
My belief is that they were, to your point, right? It's not like it's their fault. They were kind of raised that way. They were just kind of raised with, it's like the analogy to buying a car. If you don't pay attention, no one pays attention to what you're really paying. They just want to know, what's my monthly payment? So how does an advisor say, hey, I understand you think I can retire, but tell me exactly how each month or each year, how will that help me with grocery shopping or taking advantage or helping someone who's fallen ill, like you said, cognitive decline, something like that. So where and how do your tools help people with this emotional aspect of advising?
Yeah. So that's a great question. And I have sets of tools that are designed for consumers. Many of them would be financial professional clients, and then tools that are designed for the financial professionals themselves. In both cases, I view these tools as almost like coaches. So for the financial professionals, they're kind of like communication coaches. I'm assuming that they don't need help managing the portfolios. They don't need help, doing the tax loss harvesting, those kinds of technical skills. But what they do need help with is in basic communications. So, how do I talk to my client about cognitive decline? How do I talk to my client about, the husband just had a heart attack, or, the mother just got diagnosed with dementia. How do I have those discussions? So that's a big part of it. Again, it's like this coaching, how to be more empathetic, how to be more understanding, how to be a better listener, how to build those relationships. Again, because I'm assuming that the technical skills are taken care of. And then on the consumer side, there's certainly kind of a educational component to it, just better understanding how to prepare, how do I prepare for, these possible health or likely health events and costs? How do I prepare for long-term care costs? How do I prepare for cognitive decline? So there's a lot of that, but there's also communication piece there as well. Like, my dad's making some crazy financial decisions. I just noticed that his account is down, $50,000 from last month, and I don't know what he did with it. How do I talk to him about it? So there's those kinds of discussions, how do I talk to my siblings about, balancing these, caregiving responsibilities so I don't have to do anything. So there's definitely that as well. It's much less on the technical side and more on the kind of emotional side, psychological side, and just on the, the preparation side. And that's what I focus on because I know there's other great software out there that already does financial planning and all kinds of portfolio management. But I do think there's this big missing piece.
Yeah. So if I'm an advisor, I'm like a lot of professions, and you and I talked about this in our preparation. I have actually been surprised by people under the age of 35 thinking that, is my 2 cents, but thinking that AI is going to ruin things. So as I think about the new advisors coming into the market, a lot of them think that AI is going to commoditize their job, take their job away from them. What advice would you have for those younger folks? Again, just been shocked that the folks under 35 seem to be more worried about AI than over 55. Blow my mind. But what's your advice on how they can leverage AI to improve their relationships and their performance and not necessarily eliminate their jobs?
Yeah, I think that's a great question. I'm sympathetic to those concerns. I think the under 35, maybe they're a little more tech savvy and maybe they understand the power of these tools and how quickly they're getting better. I mean, that's another feature is these things are getting better faster. And we can talk more about this later, but I think that's something that especially financial professionals maybe need to be a little bit more aware of. But for a younger person, I don't blame them. I would say, certainly be very proficient in using these AI-based tools. So become an expert in using ChatGPT or Claude or whatever it is, or being, Codex or whatever that is. So really hone those skills so you can maximize basically your productivity using those tools. And then again, I think that there's certain skills that are going to be some of the last to replace are these sort of human communication, human connection skills. So I think that those would be something else you would want to really focus on and hone going forward, is to make sure that, yes, if these AI models, replace some of the skills, technical skills you have, make sure you have another set of skills, these more interpersonal skills, because that's what's going to help you stay afloat, I think, in the years, months and years ahead. And again, I do feel for those folks, but I think that's the best way to cope with this.
Yeah. In our prep call, I remember you mentioning that I think we didn't want to write it off to being older and not caring, but we talked a lot about how your point of view, there's sometimes a lot of pushback to it. And, I'm not putting words in their mouth or yours, but, he's crazy. Why is he talking about these things? Talk to the audience about what you're hearing from folks in the field when you talk to them, the ones that are embracing it versus maybe the ones that might be pushing back.
I think that a couple of things. I think it's a great question. I do sense, since I've started doing this, really about 10 years ago, I was really started getting involved in this area, and I have noticed changes since then. I have noticed more surveys, for example, asking people what their biggest retirement fears are, and those surveys are including more and more of these health-related risks. I mean, Jackson Financial just did a big survey. One of the first times I've seen, they said, you know, are you worried about high drug prices? Are you worried about Medicare? Are you worried about Social Security? Are you worried about this and that? And they ask about cognitive decline. Are you worried about, in terms of, you know, retirement? Cognitive decline was way up there. I think it was like tied for second for the highest concerns. So the fact that the first thing that impressed me is they even included a question about that in the survey. And then the fact that it didn't surprise me that so many people were concerned. But I think, you know, that I think the most important thing is there's a growing recognition, certainly among the consumers and among many professionals now, that these health-related financial risks, longevity-related risks are real. They're important. They need to be managed better. But again, I think I still feel like a little bit of an outlier in terms of what I'm focusing on. I think, you know, there's still a lot of talks about these sort of market-related risks and inflation. And I'm not saying none of that's important, but I'm saying that there's more and more evidence showing that these health-related risks are as, you know, threatening to people's retirement account as any of this other stuff. And it's really what most people are concerned about. When you think about it, if you're a 65-year-old woman or man, or, you know, in your 60s, you're 50, even 50s, you know, you're starting to deal with your parents. And if someone said, you know, are you more concerned about your dad, you know, getting dementia, or what the Federal Reserve's going to do next week? You know, that's an easy answer. You know, are you more concerned about, you know, your wife has very serious diabetes? What's that husband going to be thinking going to bed every night? He's going to be worried about his wife and how, you know, they're going to afford their lifestyle and all the things he's got to do. He's not going to be thinking about what the Fed's doing. He's not going to be thinking about the latest inflation report. So that's the other thing I try to say is, look, this is the stuff that really matters to normal people. And sure, there'll be a small subset of people. I think it's a small subset of people who are obsessed about the market and follow it every day. Yes. But your typical client, I don't think that's your typical client.
Yeah. And you can help me out here in my audience here. I've always been under the impression that softer, more vulnerable, non-numbers oriented discussions bump up against compliance. So I really can't be too empathetic about it because of compliance. I can't be too emotionally involved because of compliance. How true is that? Because I don't care. Like I would prefer that my provider be more emotionally connected. But is that a misunderstanding for those of us in the market?
I'm a little bit skeptical because what someone told me, a very good financial professional, experienced financial professional, said this to me once, and it really stuck with me. He said something to the effect that if you're a fiduciary advisor, your job, and you're legally responsible to protect your client from all financial risks, not just market risk, not just inflation risk. So you're fiduciarily bound to protecting your clients from all risks. And so to me, that just suggests, again, if these risks are real and they're perceived as real, these health-related risks, and if you're not helping your client there, then you're not doing your fiduciary duty. And to me, it's that simple. And I met with some folks. I've met with people at FINRA and the SEC, and one of the senior person at the SEC told me, he said, you know, ignoring cognitive decline does not make you less liable. So you can't.
Okay,
so I thought that was very interesting.
Yeah.
If it comes out later that you knew something, you didn't do anything about it. What he said, if you know something, do something about it. Just record. You don't have to go crazy, but just say, look, I acknowledge this. I'm concerned about it. I write it down. I talk to my client about it. So then my understanding is that then you're covered. So, you know, I'm sure there's, you know, I'm not an expert in compliance, and I'm sure there's some things I'm missing, but I do feel like that, and I feel like the authorities are more and more adopting my viewpoint, or similar to my viewpoint, is that you got to protect your clients from this stuff. You can't ignore health-related risks. You just can't.
Yeah, that's a great point of view. And all I kept thinking about is like, so what would the tipping point be between me or my advisor? And I thought of the use case, which I've never had to do, by the way, but if I've heard 5, I've heard 15, which is, how do you go to a parent and take the keys away from them?
Right.
And tell them you can't drive anymore? People have said that's one of the most emotional things, their ego, that, but in the end, right, it's about safety, and safety's right next to money.
Right.
I mean, it's about your money, your safety, or whatever. It's other people's lives. Like, somebody's got to do it. And wouldn't that be cool if my advisor said, look, if you don't want to do it, I'll do it.
Yeah. I mean, and I have in some of my chatbots, I do have help, with these discussions around driving, because they're related to other discussions around basically giving up control, like giving up control.
Yeah.
And people really like that. And I think you mentioned the key word is safety. And I think that's one thing that I've learned. I think we talked earlier. I work with some really fantastic psychiatrists in the Boston area, and they keep coming back. Especially, I work with the head of geriatric psychiatry at Mass General Hospital, Dr. Tony Weiner, and he keeps going back to safety. Keep moms. What do you need to do to keep moms safe? And that can mean a bunch of things. Keep them safe from making bad decisions. Keep her safe from getting in a car crash. My mother got in a car wreck when she was older, and she had early stage dementia, and she ran a stop sign and T-boned somebody. Unfortunately, everyone was okay, but we're like, Mom, I think we're done here.
Time to hand over
and
those
there's
keys.
some things you do, and I know families will say, "Oh yeah, Mom, the keys. I can't find the keys. I gave him the keys to Betty, and she did something with them, so you can't drive right now. I'll try to find the keys." Or, "Oh, Mom, there's I think the tire's kind of flat." So sometimes people do that, and that's fine. I mean, but it's better to have this discussion eventually and really focus on safety. It's like, I'm not pulling control away from you. I'm trying to keep you safe. That's how you want to frame the conversation.
Yeah. Before I ask you a little bit about yourself, as a transition to that, is you've mentioned a few times how cognitive decline is top of mind for you, is top of mind for your clients, things like that. But talk to us a little bit about, what this cognitive decline personally means to you. How's that helped motivate you to do what you do?
Yeah, I think there's a few things. I mean, the most significant drivers, my mother had dementia. And her mother, my grandmother, had dementia, and my mother's sister, my aunt, had dementia, and then my ex-mother-in-law had dementia. So I was really surrounded for a long time, and I got to learn about it. I spent tons of time in memory units, tons of time meeting with and talking to other residents in these memory units who were also having cognitive issues. So I was really living it, and I think that one thing that I started to see, I think there's this stigma around cognitive decline. You don't want to talk about it, or that person's kind of crazy or senile or whatever. And what really shifted, especially spending all the time in the memory units, I was just like, these people are sick. They're ill. They're not crazy. They're ill. Just like, you have a heart disease and Joe has a kidney disease, and they just have a cognitive disease. And so there's really no reason to treat them any differently in that regard. And there's no reason to have this stigma around it. It's a fact of life. You look at, I've looked at a lot of these numbers. By the time people are in their mid-80s, they have a 50% chance of having dementia or mild cognitive impairment. It just happens, We didn't evolve, our ancestors, we didn't need to be cognitively, aware when they were 80, because no one made it to 80.
No one made it that far.
You didn't make it that. You made it to 60. You were like, top 99 percentile. So I think a lot of it was around that. And then relatedly, that's sort of an emotional perspective. That's what's driving. But I've always been interested, getting back to this, behavioral economist stuff, really back since I can remember studying in college, for literally freshman year, or maybe sophomore year at the most, but, studying these theories about economic behavior. And I was really into it, and I still am. I just thought it was a really powerful way. And I didn't study in high school, but I had a sense I wanted to study in college. And a lot of it resonated, but parts of it really didn't. And the part that didn't was, when you get the standard microeconomic text that says that people make the rational decisions on all available evidence. And I remember I had a buddy of mine who was a great guy. He was a econ major and also a psych major. And we'd talk after class. We're like, nobody makes decisions that way. Do you know anybody who really, takes all available evidence, especially when you're still like a teenager and you're looking around at your buddies and you're going
you're lucky if you get to 50.
Yeah,
Yeah,
you know.
50%.
So I've always thought that, I've been very convinced that that's not how people made their decisions. And so, and my, but also, my parents were teachers. And my dad was a, college professor, and, we would have he was interested in this topic as well. But this whole idea is like, okay, we don't do it that way, clearly. So how do we make decisions? And that's when I started getting interested in this behavioral economics literature, again, even as an undergrad, and then more as a graduate student, but going way back to reading like Herbert Simon and Katona, and then, of course, reading like Kahneman, Tversky, Thaler, that kind of stuff. I just love that stuff. And I just think it's just so much closer to the real world than what's in traditional microeconomic textbooks. And yes, it makes things a lot messier and harder to model, but it's closer to reality. And I always try to stick a little bit closer to reality whenever possible.
Yeah, I think in our prep call, I mentioned that way back in I got chosen to be on the Malcolm Baldrige Best Practices Identification Team. And we spent weeks being trained on measurables. And right before we went out on the road, 15 different places, they said, oh my gosh, we forgot one thing. And we're like, what's that? Like environmental variables. And we're like, well, what's that? And the guy says, everything you can't measure. Yeah. And the 6 of us, 8 of us, everybody went like this and turned away.
Yeah.
We spent weeks on how to identify things you could measure. And the guy looks at me and goes, Griffith, you have environmental variables. I'm like, I said a few choice words. I go out on the road, and what happens is this. If you've done your job and you've built trust, and you get to the end of the meeting, so I do 5 of these a week and 2 of these a week, and we always do this, and we never do that. You're extracting. Mm-hmm. The last question is, hey, Chris, so now you believe you're not going to get fired. I have to ask you, Chris, how do you and your team succeed? What is it? What am I missing? And people would do this, Chris. They'd look around. You sure? You sure? I'm like, yeah. He goes, the camaraderie is amazing. We go bowling every Tuesday, and we knit on Thursdays, and we have a co-ed baseball team on Saturdays. I'm like, holy smokes, dude. So building tight relationships, drinking wine or whatever it might be. And they're like, yeah, but do you really have to write that down? And I got to tell you, man, as much as I appreciated all the things I learned that you could measure, the things that were harder to measure, that were emotional, that were relationship building, that was the best thing ever, man. I call that guy once every couple of years and say, thank you for giving me environmental variables.
No, that they're critical. And a lot of some of the earliest work in behavioral economics was guy, Herbert Simon, and he talked about bounded rationality, but he talked about how, again, basically how structure determines behavior. It was back almost in the behavioralist days. So, and, you can go a little too far on that, but basically saying like these environmental variables are critical. And also since then, a lot of the behavioral economists have confirmed, different pieces of that. But basically people's choices are determined in large measure by the structure. Because again, they don't have time. They don't just say, okay, here's a structure. Okay, that looks good. I'll do it. Whereas if you give them a different structure, they may say, okay, that looks fine. I'll do that too. But they're not going. That's why you see like these. There was a big one like K. There used to be you'd have to check the box to enroll it. Enroll on like you get these forms from your company. Do you want to enroll? You have to check the box, and then some behavioral economists said, well, why don't we just leave the default box checked? So you have to uncheck it if you don't want to enroll. And it turned out they made a huge difference.
Really?
Little things like that. Because again, this is structure. The structure is, okay, the box checked. So the box must be checked for a good reason. So I'll just, go with that. I don't have to think about it. Just keep going. Keep going. So you're exactly right. This stuff really, really matters. I think in the age of AI, it might get easier to measure. And one other thing I'll say, there's a study at Harvard. It's the longest running longitudinal study of human beings, basically. And it's totally biased. It's, Harvard, they're all Harvard graduates, but they've literally been following people since I think the 1930s, following many of them through their whole lives. And so the conclusion that they keep coming back with, analyzing this data is what matters most, what makes you most happy. It's not, having a lot of money. It's not having a big house. It's not traveling a lot. The most important things in life what make people really happy are strong relationships. And it's been shown over and over again that, if you have a person who's, with modest income, but they got a lot of strong relationships, they're likely to be way happier than someone who's got a ton of money and who's lonely. So it sounds almost trite and cliche, but it's really all about the relationship. And that's what my friend, the geriatric psychiatrist, says all the time. He says it's all about the relationship.
Yeah. So tell us a little bit about where you were born and how you were raised. And I know you have to include, your dad saw you as a gifted kid who was smart, and he had a belief about how someone like you should live your life and how you should help others. So where the heck were you born? A little bit about your upbringing and your dad and smart people.
Well, yeah, okay. So I was born in St. Louis, but I moved when I was a year old. My dad was teaching at Washington University in St. Louis, and then we moved to Massachusetts. So I consider myself. I don't really consider. I root for the St. Louis Cardinals a little bit, but I'm a Mass. You know what?
Nice.
Just different names for us. But I grew up in Massachusetts, went to college at Wesleyan in Connecticut, went to, to graduate work at MIT. So I'm an East Coast, Northeast Massachusetts guy. That's how I see myself. And both my parents were teachers. So my dad was a college professor. He grew up in St. Louis, and he went to WashU, and then he went to Yale. And so he was a classic egghead, absent-minded professor guy, just lived in his head all the time, spoke 6 different languages, and he was an historian. But the one thing, and then later my mother was a teacher, and then she had 4 kids and she had to put her career on hold. And then when my youngest was in high school, I want to say my mom went back to work, and she was a high school teacher. But my dad used to always say that he would say, she'd say, Chris, you're really smart. And he said this to all my siblings. And he'd say this to like any smart people. He basically thought there was this obligation, if you're smart, if you're healthy, if you're capable, to do more than just help yourself. I mean, he really strongly felt like not like it'd be nice if you did, like you have an obligation to take care and help people who are less well off financially. They may be sicker. They may be just, again, in a bad situation where they don't have the educational opportunities that I was fortunate enough to have. So, but he basically said you should always try to find a way in your career to help other people. And I'm not saying I always did that, but I think about it a lot. And I think one nice thing about what I'm working on now, at this stage of my life, I can say, look, that is really important. And that's really what I want to focus on. And hopefully it'll be, financially successful, but I really feel strongly that what I'm doing, can help people, get through some of these very difficult moments. Because now and the other thing is I've been through them. I know what it's like to have a mother with dementia, a grandmother with dementia. And my dad died fairly young. And I know what it's like to, my dad was the financial, care. He took care of all the finances. A classic. He's, that's that generation. And my mom paid some of the bills, but my dad handled all the finances, and he was very good at it. But he was, absent-minded professor, pack rat. After he died, we were just finding stock certificates and 17 different brokerage accounts and all that stuff. And it would have been much better if my dad had gotten himself a little organized, and he had enough time to do that, but he didn't. So I've seen that as well. So I think that, people do need a lot of help. And so that's what I've been sort of, trying to do, give them that assistance, because I know not just, the financial impact of these decisions, but the emotional impacts as well.
Yeah. And thanks for sharing that story, because I believe more of us have those kinds of stories than you would think. And a lot of times we feel like we're in the boat by ourselves, and it can't possibly be like this. And then when you get a chance to hear something like this, you're like, oh, wow, it's not just me. So I think that in and of itself is comforting.
Yeah, I agree.
Yeah. The 2 questions I have to kind of wrap things up. One is around failures. You mentioned a few times in our earlier discussions that what motivates you, and you mentioned that you've taken some risk, or a lot of risk in your career, I guess, some which didn't work out. But I'm curious, what can you tell us about taking risk, the failures, and what you learned from those?
Yeah, I think that I do think you almost learn more from failures than from successes. I think success can be. There's a lot of reasons for success, I want to say. And you can be really smart, and you can have good connections, or you can be really lucky. And for me, it's hard to generalize. Like if I'm, to the extent I'm successful, I always look and say, it just seemed like I was just right place, right time, right people, et cetera. And reproducing that is kind of difficult. That's why sometimes I feel I'm actually pretty crappy about giving business advice. Because it's like, well, this worked for me, but I don't know if it's going to work for you. But I think you definitely can learn from your failures. I was involved in a startup that failed spectacularly. I don't want to go into detail. It's funny now. At the time, it was kind of frustrating. But I look back, and so it's easy for me to say, okay, I know what we did. I can learn from those mistakes for sure. So I feel like those mistakes, there were sort of obvious things that we should have done that we didn't do, or things that we obviously ignored, things that we emphasized that were wrong. So I can certainly look back and see those failures. Yeah, I've taken a lot of risk. I mean, I think at a high level, I've got kind of a little bit of ADD. It's more like just after a while, I do something, and at some point I just say, I just want to do something else. And I think that is not always a recipe for success. Like if you look at really successful people, I know I have friends, and I've even seen now my kids' friends, kids that in high school, they wanted what they wanted to be. My brother did. My brother, in high school, they wanted to be an engineer. Went to engineering school, got 2 master's degrees, worked for digital, worked for Apple, worked for A&D. He always knew what he wanted to do. So in some sense, he didn't take that many risks, but he had a great career. He took a few risks that I can think of, but he had a great career. But he was an engineer. That's what he was doing. Sometimes I feel like I'm still trying to figure out what I want to do when I grow up.
Yeah.
So I've kind of, bounced around, and I think, in terms of, in some cases, I'm sure I'd be, in terms of financially, I'd be better off if I hadn't taken those risks. So what I would say to your listeners, if you're going to take a risk, and I remember somebody said this to me and I completely ignored it. They said, are you prepared to fail? This was in the startup that did fail, ironically. Senior person said, and I'm like, what do you mean? I'm not going to fail. You never think you're going to fail, but chances are you will.
Oh, yeah. I mean, startups, they're in the 90%
chances are you will
for failure. Yeah.
So how are you going to handle that? And a lot of people don't handle that well, and it's hard. So, taking risks to me has, been inevitably intertwined with failure. It just is. But there are a lot of good things about taking risks as well.
Yeah. I appreciate you sharing that. It took me a while to acknowledge that was really where I was learning more. I was raised in an environment where, hey, if you're not number one in school, then, something must be wrong. If you're not number one here, if you're not number one there. So I used to always present myself as I'm number one. I'm number one. We won the championship. I'm number one. And it wasn't until later when I don't remember when someone said, Joe, how do you do it? And I went, oh, you don't want to know. You don't want to know how many things I failed at to finally figure out how to do it right, the first time. And I think it's another important lesson that can't be offered enough, like learning how to fail. Oftentimes you hear the example of sports people, like Michael Jordan only shot 50% in his career, and his record for game-winning shots was like 40-some%, right? People like the greatest end-of-game shot maker ever, and he only did it 4 out of 10 times. Right?
Exactly.
So that's a really good numeric thing. But in the end, it's like, what did you actually learn from the 6 losses versus what did you do right on the 4 makes?
Right.
And yeah, man, I agree with you 100%. I learned a lot more. Well, one last funny anecdotal thing I think you were getting at with, and this whole discussion about emotion is I started my own business finally, not counting my DJ thing, but real day job stuff back in 2011. And I was coaching the girls basketball team, and that meant I was allowed to leave early because I was the owner and go coach basketball at 3:00 in the afternoon on Wednesdays. I was so boastful to myself about that. And I walked up, and my defensive coach said, hey, thanks for coming today, whatever. He says, Joe, how's that new business working out? His name was John. He was a doctor. He had his own business. I said, great, except for one thing. I don't feel like a big shot. And he said, Joe, the day you feel like a big shot, you're in trouble.
Right.
So I tell people all the time, what does it mean to be successful? I go, when you think you should feel like a big shot and you better not. Right. So it goes without saying that trying to stay humble, it's not about easy or not. It's how do the two things coexist? How do you embrace the gifts that you have? You're a smart guy. You're an empathetic guy. You're a creative guy. You've got a lot of composure, whatever, versus, hey, why don't I feel that way when I feel that way?
Well, yeah. There is that. And I always joke that I always wanted to be the dumbest person in the room. I'm serious. I mean, I was when I was at MIT, I was literally in rooms with Nobel Prize winning economists,
Yeah,
literally.
come on, man. Seriously.
And so the idea of being the smartest person in the room, that's the thing I least aspire to, because if you're the smartest person in the room, you don't learn anything. Again, both my parents are teachers. If you're the dumbest person in the room, when you walk out of the room, you're going to learn something.
Yeah.
And maybe you'll contribute something, hopefully. It's always like, maybe I have a small idea that some people might like. But I always try to surround myself with really smart people. And I can learn from I learn from you. I mean, I learn from everybody. So that's the approach that I take. I don't think I'm really smarter than anybody. I have a certain subset where I know more about, some things than other people, but everybody in the world knows something I don't know. So I can learn from them.
Yeah. You're a great example. You're a great example of something I call every conversation matters. I'm not sure if we talked about this, but I started to give some talks to younger kids. And I think that's what you're getting at as I try to tell younger kids, don't judge the book by its cover. You're meeting someone new. This is what they do for a living, or this is how they appear, or whatever. You have to be engaged in a conversation for whatever reason. There are gifts in that conversation. You just got to dig a little bit, be a little patient, be inquisitive, and you be really, really surprised how often you get every conversation matters. And
it does.
That's why I'm really super glad that we reconnected for this.
Me too.
It's been a real pleasure. Before we go, can you offer to my audience where they can find you, how they can reach out to you, websites, emails, all that good stuff?
So I'm on LinkedIn a lot. So just Chris Heye. There's not too many Chris Heyes in the world. Chris Heye, PhD. Hopefully the picture still looks like me. It's getting a little old, but you should be able to figure that out. And I have a LinkedIn newsletter that you might want to subscribe to. I post a lot.
Cool.
I post like almost every week. And I write a regular column for the nerds in the audience. I do write a regular column, comes out like every 2 or 3 months in the Journal of Financial Planning. So it's kind of it's great. They let me just talk about, what I've been thinking about. And it's mostly along these issues of health, wealth, longevity, the intersection of all those. So you can find me there. I've got a few websites. I would go to wealthchat.ai. And the wealth is spelled with an extra H. So it's WHEALTH chat. So it's combination of health and wealth. So go to Wealth Chat. You can see some of my latest products. There's links to, you can look at my publications and speaking engagements. And I don't do much other social media. So that's the way. Or I could do, that's the best way. And if you're on LinkedIn, just, if you're interested, just message me saying, hey, I saw your talk with Joe. Love to find out more. I check my messages on LinkedIn almost every day. So I'll get it that way. And that's probably the best way to find me. And if you want, Joe, you can put my email address in the notes. But,
we'll drop that in there. We will.
Drop
Absolutely
it in there. But I'd love to hear from people. I'd love to hear what you're thinking, why I'm right. Even more, I'd love to hear why I'm wrong. Because again, I'll learn more. That way.
Yeah, for sure. Well, thanks again, Chris. My audience is going to love this conversation. Thanks for being on the show.
Thanks, Joe. Great to be here.
This brings us to the end of another episode, and I'll see you on the next one.
Magic in the Cloud podcast requires more than a conversation. It takes action, research, and collective wisdom. If today's episode resonated with you, we'd love to hear your insights. Join the conversation and help us shape the future together. We'll be back with more stories, strategies, and real-world solutions that are making a difference for everyone. In the meantime, be sure to subscribe, rate, write a review, and share it with someone you think would benefit from it too. Thanks for listening, and we'll see you on the next episode.